Hello, lovely souls, and welcome to Emily Whispers. I'm Emily, and I'm so happy you decided to join me tonight. I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop a comment and say hello. I love connecting with each of you. If these little moments bring you peace, please like and subscribe so we can share more of them together. Now find your cozy spot. Wrap yourself in a blanket if you like. Take a slow, gentle breath, and let's drift into tonight's story. Most people dream of a weekend escape into the wild, a place where the only sounds are the breaking of dry leaves under your boots, the call of birds at dawn, and your own thoughts finally quieting down. I never thought that dream could become my personal nightmare, yet every time I remember that weekend in the Appalachian mountains with my cousins, my heart makes a hard, fast rhythm in my chest, as if I am still staring down that endless dirt road, waiting for lights to appear in the darkness. My cousin Mark was the kind of person who believed fresh air could fix anything. He said we needed a real weekend. His voice was both an invitation and a challenge. Get out of the city, clear our heads, spend time where the world didn't push into every corner of your mind. My grandmother refused to let us go without a warning. She smiled, but her eyes were heavy with experience as she placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You be careful up there in the mountains." I dismissed it as old family superstition. We left before the sun was fully up. A dark SUV loaded with coolers, fishing gear, and an old lantern Mark insisted was better than anything modern. By late afternoon, after hours of driving past coal towns and winding mountain backroads, the ridges rose before us like ancient, sleeping giants. The final stretch was a logging trail so narrow and overgrown that the trees seemed intent on reclaiming the path. My phone had lost its connection about 20 miles back. Now, all I could see were endless forested hills, the trail behind us seeming to disappear as if the world ended there. When the cabin came into view, it looked more like a modern mistake than a rustic retreat. It was in a frame, its sharp angles out of place among the old trees. The porch steps were solid and new, but the large windows felt like dark, vacant eyes. Mark called it a hidden gem. I thought it looked vulnerable and isolated. There were no other cabins, no power lines, nothing but the sound of the wind moving through the trees that pressed in as if they were listening. Inside, the air was clean, with the scent of pine cleaner and new wood. My other cousin, Leo, made a show of appreciating the modern kitchen, but Mark simply called it functional. We set up our gear in the loft, unpacked a worn board game, and made sandwiches. There was a heavy, unspoken effort to make this trip feel normal, maybe even fun. It lasted about an hour. Then, Mark eyed the small bag of charcoal for the grill and realized it wouldn't be enough for the weekend. With the evening light already turning gold, he decided we would make a quick trip to the nearest general store, 20 miles back the way we had come. I took the back seat, surrounded by the smell of nylon sleeping bags and the dust that never really settles in a well-used vehicle. The forest pressed in on both sides. As Mark navigated the trail, the SUV moved with a heavy, swaying motion over the ruts carved out by years of rain and ice. I was just beginning to relax, my head resting against the window, when I spotted a set of headlights in the rearview mirror. They were coming up fast, too fast. An old Jeep, its dark green paint almost black in the shadows, appeared from the trees as if it had been waiting there. At first, I thought it must be a local. No one else would know how to drive this stretch of trail. Then, with no warning, the Jeep closed the distance to within a few feet of our back bumper. My stomach felt tight when I saw there was no license plate, and the windshield was so clean it reflected the forest like a dark mirror. Mark's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "She's in a hurry," Leo whispered. Mark did not answer, his eyes fixed on the broken ribbon of trail ahead. The Jeep did not pass, just stayed close to us, moving forward and back in sharp, sudden bursts, as if its driver was deciding whether to overtake us or drive right into our back end. My skin felt cold. A bead of sweat trailed down my back, despite the air turning cool as the sun went down. When the gap between our vehicles closed to a foot, Mark slowed the SUV. For a second, I thought he might pull over. Then ahead, a fallen log partially blocked the trail, forcing us to stop. The Jeep behind us came to a hard stop, and I felt my whole body tense for an impact that never came. Mark put the SUV in park. The driver's door of the Jeep flew open. A woman climbed out. She was in her late 20s maybe, but her face was smooth and calm in a way that seemed out of place. Her dress was a simple, clean blue. Her boots were spotless. She moved with a slow, deliberate energy, her jaw set. In the shifting light of dusk, her eyes seemed to absorb the light, never reflecting it. Mark got out. "Get back in your vehicle," he said, not yelling, not begging, just flat and final. Leo reached for the tire iron under his seat. The woman froze mid-stride, her shoulders squared as if she was about to spring forward. She looked from my cousin to us, then up the trail behind us. Another distant vehicle made a sound as it crossed a ridge, the rarest of lifelines. Suddenly, the woman smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that never reached her eyes. Without a word, she moved back to her Jeep, got inside, and reversed down the trail, the vehicle disappearing into the trees. For a moment, none of us moved. The silence pressed in, broken only by Mark's shaky exhale as he slid back behind the wheel. "You think she was lost?" Leo asked, his voice forced and brittle. "Probably," Mark answered, but his jaw stayed tight. I watched his eyes move again and again to the rearview mirror as we continued down the trail, our headlights making restless patterns between the trees. We found the store. We found charcoal. We exchanged uneasy laughs, forced and artificial, as if we could shake the tension free and let it disappear among the shelves of canned goods. The sun had dropped behind the hills, the sky shifting to bruised purple and deep indigo. As we pulled out to head back to the cabin, there she was again. The same battered Jeep sat idling at the turnoff to the trail, its lights off. She looked right at us. Mark let out a sound, a sharp, humorless noise, as if his intent was to break the moment. "Big hurry, nowhere to go," he said. Then in a strange flash, he honked the horn twice. The woman's head moved in our direction. For a heartbeat, the world felt still. Then something changed in her. The Jeep's engine made a deep, powerful sound. It shot backward onto the main road, the tires making a high-pitched noise. It turned violently before charging at us, the engine making a loud, strained sound like a wounded animal. Mark slammed his foot on the gas, the SUV lurching as we shot down the trail, gravel flying wildly. The Jeep missed us by inches, turning in a wide, angry arc before locking on and surging after us. I felt the seatbelts dig into my shoulders as Mark floored the accelerator. The SUV made a high sound of its own, straining against the narrow curves and inclines. The Jeep's headlights painted the inside of our car a brilliant, painful white whenever we glanced back. Every curve felt like it could be our last, but Mark's hands never left the wheel, his knuckles pale, his focus on the vanishing thread of trail. Behind us, the engine's loud sound continued. The headlights were a bright glare, never falling behind for more than a heartbeat. Finally, salvation, the clearing of the cabin. Mark turned the steering wheel hard, sending up a spray of dirt as we came to a stop near the porch. Behind us, the Jeep came to a halt at the edge of the trees, the sound of its horn a long, desperate note before it went silent. When I looked back, there was nothing but the empty trail, the trees standing guard on both sides. We did not slow down as we ran from the battered SUV into the clearing beside the cabin. The last of the sunlight was draining away. Mark parked. The frame loomed before us, black against the deepening sky. The woods felt closer now, darker. Inside, the silence felt heavy, pressing on my chest. Leo double-checked the locks, moving from window to window. Mark stood silently by the largest window, watching the trail disappear into darkness. That night, just as I'd managed to close my eyes, the old landline phone began to make a shrill noise. The only connection to the outside, kept for emergencies. Leo answered. I could hear my grandmother's voice, sharp and clear on the other end. Get my grandbaby out of there right now. Leo listened, then put the phone down in silence. He didn't pack. No one offered to leave. Sleep was impossible. Every time the old floorboard settled, it sounded like footsteps. Around 2 a.m, as the wind made a low sound through the trees, I heard the unmistakable noise of an engine on the trail far down the lane. It was slow, deliberate, moving forward. I froze, every muscle tight. The sound moved closer, then faded into the dark. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside, desperate for light and air. What I saw on the ground made my mouth go dry. Fresh tire tracks led up to just before the tree line, then disappeared, looping back the way they had come. There was no mistaking them. I felt a chill that lingered far longer than the mountain morning. We never returned to that cabin. Mark still talks about it sometimes, always with a tight smile that does not reach his eyes. We all know what we saw and what we felt. That woman in the Jeep was not lost. She was not just angry. She wanted something. And some part of her, thanks to that night, still lingers on the backroads of the Appalachians, in the dark trails and isolated cabins where the wild is close, waiting for the next traveler who does not listen to the warning in their grandmother's voice. If you ever find yourself driving into the mountain night and a battered Jeep appears from the trees to follow you, do not stop. Do not let her see your eyes in the mirror. And above all, when the trail ahead seems to vanish into darkness, remember sometimes it is better not to find out what is waiting on the other side. The fire tower was not ours. It belonged to Chloe's grandfather, a retired park ranger. It was a relic, decommissioned for years, standing on a ridge so deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains that even the county maps showed it as a blank space. After a semester from hell, with failed exams, a bitter breakup, and the kind of anxiety that settles in your bones, the idea of total isolation sounded like a cure. No internet, no people, just the wind and the kind of silence you can only find high above the valleys. There were 4 of us making the trip: me, my boyfriend Liam, our friend Chloe, and her partner Sam, who I had met maybe twice before. Sam turned out to be one of those people who filled every silence with local lore, most of it unsettling. For the better part of 3 hours, he spoke of strange disappearances in these hills, as if reciting from a family Bible. If you see lights in the Holler where there should not be any, do not follow them, he said, staring out the passenger window as the ridges rolled past. It is a trick. I laughed, because that was the normal response. Sam did not laugh back. That was when I realized he was not joking. The drive felt like a slow climb into another world. We started on paved highways, passed through small towns with their lone gas stations and sagging porches, then watched civilization fade until there was nothing but forest pressing in on more forest. The road narrowed with each mile, asphalt giving way to gravel, then to a dirt track that made the truck's suspension complain with every bump. My phone lost its connection about an hour before we arrived, the last bar of service winking out like a dying firefly. When we finally pulled into the small, overgrown clearing, the light was already turning a soft, hazy gold. The fire tower stood there like a skeleton, a glass and steel box perched on 4 towering legs. No electricity, no running water, definitely no cell towers for 50 miles. Chloe grinned like she had just brought us to a secret paradise. We came to disconnect, she announced, shouldering her backpack with the enthusiasm of someone who had never spent a night without a Wi-Fi signal. The first night was everything we had hoped for, almost peaceful. We got a small propane stove going for heat in the glass-walled cabin, opened a few beers, and played a tattered board game by the flickering light of battery-powered lanterns. The air inside smelled of old metal and damp wood, but it was not unpleasant. Liam started telling jokes, the kind you make up as you go along, each one more ridiculous than the last. Chloe threw a balled-up sock at him whenever a punchline did not land. We laughed until the propane heater began to sputter, then unrolled our sleeping bags on the cold metal floor. I fell asleep to the gentle sound of the wind moving around the tower, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The mountain air was clean and thin, and for the first time all semester, my mind felt still. I woke once during the night, not to any particular sound, just that strange awareness that comes when you are sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. I lay there staring up at the metal-beamed ceiling, wondering how long it had been holding this box up in the sky. Long enough to feel permanent, ancient even. The silence outside was absolute. No traffic, no neighbors, no hum of a power grid, just the kind of profound quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Day 2 started fine. Cold mountain air bit at our faces when we stepped out onto the catwalk, but the sun was brilliant, and the sky was that deep, cloudless blue you never see in the city. Chloe wanted to explore. Her grandfather had told her about a trail that led to an old, abandoned weather station. No signs, no maps. Just follow the ridgeline and trust your instincts. It sounded simple enough. We packed snacks and water bottles and set off through the trees. At first, it was magical. The air felt cleaner than anything I had ever breathed, and the ground was soft underfoot, a carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves. We joked and took pictures, arguing about who was most likely to survive a zombie apocalypse. But after about an hour of hiking, I started to notice something unsettling. Everything looked the same, not just similar, but identical. The formations of rocks, the gnarled shapes of the trees, all blurred together in a way that made it impossible to distinguish one landmark from another. When I mentioned it, Chloe brushed off my concern. "My grandpa hikes here all the time," she said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Another hour passed, and even Chloe looked less certain. The light had started to shift, taking on that dull, grayish tone that warns of approaching dusk. That was when Sam stopped dead in his tracks, staring down at something near his feet. "Did you guys see this before?" he asked, his voice tight. We all crowded around. There, placed carefully in the center of the trail, was a small stack of flat stones. Not a natural formation, a cairn, but it was built with a precision that was unnerving. Each stone was perfectly balanced on the one below it. The rocks were still cold and damp, as if they had just been pulled from a creek bed. None of us had built it. "Maybe some other hiker has a weird hobby," Chloe said, forcing a laugh that did not sound like her usual one at all. "You know, a bit of trail art or whatever." But the cairn looked wrong. Too perfect, too deliberate. And there was something about the way it was placed, right where we had to pass, us. We kept moving, but faster now. No one wanted to admit we were lost, but the sun was sinking behind the ridges, and none of us recognized anything. My chest felt tight the entire way back. When the fire tower finally appeared through the trees, the relief hit me so hard I nearly laughed out loud. But then I saw the hatch. We had locked it from the inside that morning. I remembered the sound of the heavy metal bolt sliding into place. Remember Chloe testing the handle twice to make sure it was secure. Now, it was slightly ajar, just a crack, but enough to see the darkness beyond. Liam went up the stairs first, muttering something about the wind, but wind does not lift heavy steel bolts. Inside, nothing looked obviously disturbed. Our packs were where we had left them. Sleeping bags still spread across the floor. The cold remains of our breakfast were still on the small table. But my water bottle, the one I had left on the windowsill, was now sitting on the outside catwalk railing. Nobody said a word about it. We just started the heater and stayed close to each other, as if the warmth could explain everything away. That night, the quiet felt different, heavier. Every time the tower shifted in the wind, my stomach tightened. By midnight, Liam and Sam were snoring, a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. Chloe was curled up near the heater, her breathing deep and even. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the shadows that seemed to crawl across the glass with each gust of wind. Sometime later, I woke up cold. The heater had gone out, the propane tank empty. I got up to relight the lantern, and that was when I noticed the front window. Earlier, I had watched Chloe struggle with the old latch, needing both hands to force the warped window shut. The mechanism was stiff, stubborn, requiring real effort to engage. Now the window was unlatched, open just enough to let in a sliver of frigid air. I stood there for a long moment, my heart making a hard, painful rhythm in my chest. Then I reached out and relatched it, the old metal making a soft sound as it engaged. I did not wake anyone, did not want to. Maybe I was afraid they would confirm what I already suspected, that someone had been inside while we slept. I crawled back under my blanket, pulling it tight around my shoulders, as if the fabric could provide protection against whatever was out there in the darkness. I do not know how long I slept before the sound woke me. A high, thin whistling. At first, I thought it might be the wind moving through the tower's steel frame. But then I realized the sound was not coming from the structure. It was outside, drifting through the fog like a signal. Not words, just a single, piercing note that seemed to come from all directions at once. The hair on my arm stood up as I listened, every muscle in my body locked tight. The whistling stopped. Then came a series of soft, rhythmic impacts against the glass window, almost polite. My throat felt tight. I wanted to scream, to wake the others, but nothing came out. My whole body had turned to stone. The sounds did not come again at that window. Instead, I heard them at the next one and the one after that. Slow, deliberate sounds, moving around the glass cabin, circling us like a curious animal. I lay there staring at the windows, waiting for the glass to break. It never did. When dawn finally came, pale light seeping through the thick fog, I unzipped my sleeping bag before anyone else woke up. The air outside was still and cold. On the glass of the windows, traced in the thick layer of frost, were patterns, intricate, swirling designs, like abstract art, covering every inch of glass, all the way around the tower. The patterns were hypnotic and wrong. Too perfect, too uniform, like a message had been written for us in the cold. We left within the hour, and I have never been back to the Blue Ridge since. They say the mountains give you what you need. Solitude, clarity, the hard lessons you would never have learned at home. I thought the old mountain cabin would give me silence, an off-grid refuge, a place to forget the broken pieces of my life back in the city. In reality, it gave me a different lesson, one that keeps me up at night, reminding me that sometimes isolation is just an invitation for unwanted attention. My friend's offer came just after my world fell apart. A relationship in ruins, my job prospects gone, and my tiny apartment filled with boxes I stubbornly refused to unpack. If you need to get away, the old place is yours, rent-free, he said in a phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes. Just don't burn it down. The drive into the heart of the mountains was long and punishing. 3 straight hours from the nearest hint of civilization, my rental car complaining at every gravel turn. As I rounded the final bend, my phone gave up its last flicker of connection and became nothing more than a useless piece of glass and metal. The cabin looked as if it had been stranded in time. A single story, its porch slumped to one side, the weathered boards faded from brown to a pale gray under decades of rain and sun. One window was covered in plywood where a storm had once shattered the glass. Every detail spoke of age, exhaustion, and above all, secrets. I arrived just before dusk, the forest pressing close, unmoving in the thick mountain twilight. The silence was a physical thing. No wind, not even birds, just the steady, nervous rhythm of my own heart. No neighbors, no power lines, no distant headlights. The days passed easily at first. I walked the faint trails my friend's grandfather had used to hunt decades before, splitting logs in the clearing until my hands were sore and my skin tingled with sun. Nights were lit by a single lantern, filled with the sound of moths fluttering against the glass and the soft rustle of whatever wildlife haunted the undergrowth. Slowly, the relentless echo of my failed life in the city began to quiet. Those emails, those arguments, that final sound of a door closing faded bit by bit. The first odd thing was just a feeling, the sensation of being watched, a prickle of skin along the back of my neck as I moved around the clearing. But in a strange place, far from home, a little paranoia seemed natural. I shrugged it off. 2 weeks in, I encountered a man. It happened down by the creek as twilight settled in the low places and the water ran the color of dark tea. He stood across from me, not moving, his hands in the pockets of his old, worn jeans. He wore a red flannel shirt 3 sizes too large and had a wild, unkempt beard. He looked my age, maybe younger, but there was a hardness in his eyes that felt ancient. "You staying in the old Miller place?" he called, his voice flat as a stone, clear across the water. I hesitated. "Yeah, that's right." I tried to sound cheerful, as if I belonged there as much as he did. He nodded, not smiling. "Holler if you need anything," he said, and then he vanished into the trees, his footsteps as soft as falling leaves. For a day, I convinced myself that it was fine. Locals keep an eye out for strangers, right? Maybe that is how it is in the deep country. Unwritten rules, casual surveillance. When I saw him again 3 days later at the edge of the clearing, his arms folded, just watching as I split wood, I raised a hand. He did not wave back. After that, I started seeing him everywhere. Not always close. Sometimes just a streak of red among the trees as I hiked. Sometimes just the certainty of eyes watching from beyond the reach of my lantern at night. The feeling of being watched deepened, growing roots. I began double-checking the locks before bed, placing an upturned glass on the doorknob so that any movement would make a sound and wake me. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was alone in the wilderness. Nerves were part of the package. When the first note appeared, I tried to dismiss it as a practical joke. It was a simple sheet of lined paper, weighed down with a flat stone, lying on the porch after my morning walk. In neat, black block letters, it read, "Nice to see you by the creek." No name, no signature, nothing overtly threatening. Just a reminder that I was not as alone as I thought. My hands shook a bit as I read it, but I forced a laugh, as if mocking myself could hold the anxiety at bay. 2 days later, another note. "You look tired today." That one made my stomach feel tight. Was he close enough to see me sleeping? Was he watching as I made coffee, as I checked the windows, as I tried to go about my life? I began locking the door during the day. I stopped walking the trails, kept my axe nearby as I split wood, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. One morning, I discovered the axe was missing from the chopping block. I searched everywhere, my mind spinning with possibilities. Had I left it in the shed, dropped it by the creek? But I knew I would never misplace something as essential as that. Not out here. Someone had taken it. That night, determined not to be scared, I stayed up late reading by the lantern. The rifle my friend had left in a closet, resting within arm's length. My book felt useless, the words slipping away as the darkness outside pressed closer. I blew out the lantern and sat listening. The moon had not risen, and the black beyond the windows was thick, almost oily. Then the porch made a soft sound as a board settled under weight. Once, a pause, then again, closer to the door. My every instinct told me that something was wrong, and I gripped the rifle so tightly my hands ached. Silence fell. Then a single, deliberate touch against the door. Not a hard sound, just a light contact, as if someone wanted to see if I was scared. When I finally gathered the nerve to look, nothing was there. Just muddy footprints on the steps, leading back into the trees. The next day, I drove to the general store in town, my heart making a hard, fast rhythm for the entire journey. I tried to keep my voice calm as I described the man to the store owner. He frowned, considering, then shook his head. The only other cabin up that way burned down 20 or 25 years ago, he said. Nobody's been living up there since. Might get a hiker maybe, but I haven't seen anyone that fits that description. It felt like the bottom had fallen out of my stomach. I thanked him and bought more supplies, stopping at the sheriff's office to report the axe missing. They promised to look into it, standard small-town reassurances, but no one ever stopped by the cabin. As the sun slid toward the western ridges, I made the drive back, every inch of me on edge. That night, determined to keep busy, I cooked an elaborate meal, read 2 chapters from a dusty novel, and propped a chair against the door. Then I waited, the rifle loosely in my lap, the world outside entirely silent except for the sound of the fire. Around 3 in the morning, a new sound cut through the darkness. A dog barking, furious and close, right outside the window. The noise stopped in the middle of a sound, replaced once more by that unbearable silence. Then the doorknob moved once, twice, as if someone was testing its resolve. I shouted, "I have a gun." My voice was rough in the darkness. The knob stilled. A slow, almost thoughtful silence followed. Then I heard footsteps moving around the cabin, soft and slow, ending in a dull impact against the back wall. Once, twice, hard enough to make the lamp on my table tremble. Something or someone was out there, waiting for me to break. When the sounds against the wall stopped, I did not wait. I grabbed my bag, scooped up the rifle, and climbed out a bedroom window into the night. The ground was cold beneath my feet, the air stinging my lungs as I ran through the low brush, branches clawing at my arms and face. I did not stop running until my legs burned, and I saw the gleam of headlights on gravel. I reached the main road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver, a young woman with a weary expression, drove me to the sheriff's office. I told my story, showed them the notes, described the man in careful detail. They listened, nodded, and promised to check the cabin. When I returned the next morning with deputies, the world looked different. Snow had fallen during the night, dusting the cabin roof white, erasing any tracks. The deputies searched and found nothing. The axe was missing, but otherwise everything looked untouched. As I packed my things, my heart fractured and my mind frayed. I found one last note left in the center of the table. "You should have stayed longer, nothing more." The handwriting was the same. Precise, black letters, blocky and even. I left. I drove until the land flattened, until the trees retreated in my mirrors, and the sky grew blank and forgiving. I returned the keys to my friend, mumbled apologies, and avoided his eyes. When he heard the story, he said nothing, just nodded and muttered that some things in the mountains should be left alone. Months have passed, yet I still see the man in my dreams, always standing at the tree line, his arms folded, his eyes hidden in shadow. I can still feel the chill of those dark woods, the certainty that what I saw was not a hallucination, but a deliberate, slow game, a test of how long I could last before panic won. On quiet nights back in the city, when the wind moves through the alleys and my mind is too busy for sleep, I remember the cold mountain dawn, the prints on the porch, and the notes that mapped my slow unraveling. Sometimes I ask myself, was the man ever real? Or just the mountain's way of reminding me that true solitude is never empty? Perhaps the land itself was watching, using a man's shape, a neighbor's face, just to remind me that not all those who watch you from the trees wish you well. If you ever find yourself in those hills, the guest of some forgotten family legacy, do not mistake silence for safety. Sometimes the watcher is flesh and blood, sometimes not. Either way, if someone offers you a place of refuge far from home, remember you're always being watched. You just might not see the eyes staring back at you from the trees. The arrangement was Sarah's idea. My sister had inherited the cabin years ago, a relic from our mother's side of the family, and she pitched the trip like it would fix everything. Stress from my job, the loneliness that had crept in since my move to the city, just the two of us retreating to her cabin in the hills of eastern Kentucky, tucked deep in a hollow where the dirt roads vanished and the ridges shut you in. Far from cell service, from deadlines, from the constant roar of the world. It sounded, at least on paper, like a cure. The drive was 5 long hours. The first part was easy enough. Interstates, chain restaurants, sunlight flashing on the windshield. We sang along to old songs, swapped stories from when we were kids, let the music drown out the weight of our silence. Then the road narrowed. Pavement turned to gravel, then to clay ruts winding through thickets of oak and pine. Steep ridges crowded closer. The last gas station fell behind, then the last farmhouse, until we were crawling along a 1-lane track cut into the mountainside. Switchbacks sharp enough to make your stomach turn. When the cabin appeared, it looked like something forgotten by time, tolerated only because the mountain had not yet swallowed it. The roof sagged under moss and leaves. The chimney leaned slightly, and ivy climbed up the porch posts like a slow green hand. The cabin sat perched above a creek, its water rushing pale and cold over dark stone. The windows were dulled by years of grime, and behind one curtain I thought I saw a faint swaying, though no breeze stirred. Inside, it was one room with a low ceiling, a cracked wood stove, and a table carved with initials from long-dead relatives. It smelled of damp timber, dust, and something sharper, like rust or mildew that had seeped too deep to be scrubbed away. Sarah lit the lantern she'd brought, and by nightfall, we had a fire snapping in the stove. The glow made the place seem almost cheerful. We played cards, made supper on the old cast iron skillet, and for a little while convinced ourselves we were better off here. It was close to midnight when I noticed the prints. The front door had not latched right, and it hung open a crack, letting in the chill. On the outside of the window pane, pressed into the grime, were dozens of handprints. Small ones, too small for an adult, too clear for any animal. They covered the glass in clusters, palms and fingers outlined sharply, as if children had crowded close to peer in. "Sarah, look at this," I whispered. She came over, her face pale in the lantern glow. "That's not right," she said flatly. "Maybe kids came up from the valley, playing tricks." She tried to laugh, but it fell thin. We shut and locked every door and window, both of us suddenly aware of how flimsy old boards felt against the dark. Daylight made it worse. The handprints hadn't faded, not even a little. They were crisp, as if newly pressed, despite the morning frost on the window. No tracks showed in the dirt outside. No signs anyone had hiked the mile of rutted trail to reach us. Only the prints, layered and overlapping, like the children had never left the glass. We stayed inside, keeping to books and half-hearted conversation. The silence of the hollow pressed down on us, broken only by the creek's endless rush. As evening fell, that silence grew heavy, as though the mountain itself was listening. Around 1 a.m, when the lantern was burning low, the old rocking chair on the porch began to move. Its steady creak rose and fell, back and forth, though the air outside was still. Sarah's book slipped from her hands. We sat frozen, staring at its silhouette shifting across the curtains. Then came a sound so faint I thought I'd imagined it. A child humming, soft and tuneless, circling the cabin. Sometimes it stopped just beyond the porch, as if waiting. "You hear that?" Sarah whispered. "It's like a lullaby." I nodded, every heartbeat a hammer in my chest. Then 3 knocks sounded at the door, slow and deliberate. The floor trembled with each impact. After a pause, a voice floated from the dark, soft, polite. "You don't belong here." Every muscle in my body locked. Sarah's knuckles whitened on the edge of the table. "We have to leave," she breathed. We didn't argue. I jammed my feet into my boots. Sarah grabbed her coat, and we burst through the back door, racing down the narrow trail toward the truck we'd left by the creek crossing. No flashlight, no plan, just the pounding of blood and the crunch of leaves. Behind us came the sound of footsteps, wet and slow, keeping pace, sometimes too close, and woven between them was that faint humming, brushing the air at our backs. We reached the truck, scrambling inside, hands shaking as Sarah fought the key into the ignition. It sputtered once, then caught. Gravel sprayed behind us as we tore down the narrow track. From the rearview mirror, in the blur of trees, I thought I saw a line of pale shapes standing along the porch rail, watching. Later, at the sheriff's office in town, an old deputy took our statement. He drove up to check the cabin, but when he came back, he claimed he found nothing. No prints on the glass, no tracks in the dirt, no rocking chair on the porch. "Probably just spooked yourselves," he said, but his eyes lingered on us in a way that suggested he didn't believe his own words. Sarah sold the cabin within the year, not caring if it rotted into the hillside. We only spoke of that night a handful of times afterward, never with the right words. And sometimes, when the house is still around me in the dark, I catch myself staring at my window, half expecting to see a small handprint bloom on the glass, half expecting to hear that low, tuneless humming outside, circling, waiting for me to come back to the hollow. I was 17 when I first set foot in my grandfather's hunting cabin. He had owned the place for years, but always went alone. It was a rustic little home, surrounded on all sides by a thick, ancient forest and hills that rolled on, never ending, never letting anything go. The only road leading out there was a snake of hard-packed dirt, twisting for miles through valleys carpeted in moss and shadow. My grandfather called the place peaceful. He called it the best silence you'll ever find. After a year swallowed by adolescent chaos, I believed him. He warned me. No cell service, no neighbors, no casual hikers. Not even a radio signal worth chasing. It was exactly what I thought I wanted. He handed me the keys and said, "Just keep to yourself out here, and nothing will bother you." He sounded so sure, almost superstitious, the way old country folks say things with a finality that makes you second-guess your city-bred skepticism. I nodded and smiled, pretending to be confident, while inside I felt a thrill. Or maybe it was apprehension. The drive took all morning and part of the afternoon. With every curve, the world felt farther away. There were no road signs after a certain point, just the unyielding wilderness. Then, around the last bend, the cabin materialized, faded and hunched, nearly camouflaged amongst the trees. Its roof was drooping, the shingles mottled and green with lichen. It looked older than the trees that stood behind it, like sentinels. If a home is where the heart is, then this cabin's heart had been beating for a very long time. Inside, the air smelled of old books and wood smoke. Sunlight slipped between the warped boards in thin, pale ribbons, illuminating the dust motes in the air. There was no electricity. The single main room held all the essentials: a battered armchair, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, a faded plaid cot, and a kitchen so basic it seemed designed for another century. Yet, as simple as it was, the place felt thick with echoes. Everything that had been blown in on the wind, every story lived or invented, was still here in the silence. For the first 2 days, it was perfect. I cooked eggs on a propane stove, read ancient paperbacks by lamplight, and strolled the well-worn trails behind the cabin, following them as they meandered through gloomy hollows and up mossy ridges. The quiet was so profound, it felt loud. Gone were the hum and thrum of traffic, the phone alarms, the voices of friends and enemies, the city's electric buzz in the air. Here, the forest muffled everything except the wild birds, distant water, the trees flexing in unseen breezes. On the third night, things began to change. I had gone out after dinner to gather firewood. The sun was already slipping low, painting the world in crimson and violet. As I headed toward the woodpile, a mere 20 paces from the porch, I realized something subtle yet deeply unsettling. Spatially, the clearing seemed smaller, as if the trees had edged forward while I slept. The path felt longer than I remembered. Every familiar landmark was just a bit off, shifted by some trick of the twilight that made my stomach tighten. I laughed it off and blamed fatigue, even cracked a joke aloud about the mountains playing tricks on city folks. But the unease remained, a low hum underlying the quiet. That night, I fed the fire and sat in the armchair, reading halfway through a battered thriller before my eyelids grew heavy. I dozed, but was suddenly jolted alert just before midnight, unsure what had woken me. The fire was still burning. Nothing had moved. I listened and heard only the restless stirring of the forest outside. I must have drifted back to sleep, but I remember being pulled from my dreams by a single, deliberate impact on the door. It was not loud, but it was definite. I froze. There was no way anyone should have been there. No cars, no roads past the drop-off point, not a soul for miles. My grandfather had always claimed the mountain was private land and otherwise unvisited. The sound on the door did not come again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was the wind and tried to rest, but my mind would not settle. Every time an old board shifted or the wind moved a loose gutter, I sat up straight and listened for more sounds. In the morning, I tried to shake it off. I cooked breakfast and told myself if anything was out there, I would have seen prints or something odd. Yet, when I returned from fetching water at the stream, a walk of barely 15 minutes, the cabin door was wide open. My first irrational thought was that maybe a raccoon or a fox had forced the latch. But as I stepped inside, a cold certainty settled over me. Every chair, there were 4, had been pulled into the center of the room and arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward. I stood paralyzed. It was the kind of thing that looked wrong on a bone-deep level, as if I had caught a wild animal wearing a human face for a moment. I walked around the circle, expecting to find something in the middle, a token, a mark, a charm, but the circle was empty. After a long time, I shoved the chairs back, locked the door twice, and sat near the fire, my hands shaking. The next night, as dusk fell and darkness filled every gap between the planks, the cabin changed. The fire seemed to burn less brightly. The darkness outside felt alive. Sometime after midnight, I heard a slow, heavy dragging sound outside, like a sack being pulled across the porch. The sound circled the cabin. At its softest, it was almost comforting. At its loudest, it was the stuff of nightmares. I sat clutching the poker from the fireplace and forced myself not to look out the window. I do not know if I slept. At some point, I must have, because I woke to a faint, broken humming sound from inside the walls. The old clock on the mantel, which had never made a sound before, began to make a long, toneless noise. a sound that did not belong to any clock I knew. After a sleepless dawn, I opened the cabin door and found a toothbrush, my toothbrush, placed on the step, set neatly in the center, its bristles pointed toward the woods. I had left it in the bathroom, packed in a bag. My skin felt so intensely cold my scalp tingled. Rationality dissolved. I raced to my car and tried to start it. The engine sputtered, turned again, but would not catch. My hands shook violently. I spent the next hour staring at the trees, expecting to see the shape of a man or an animal. But the woods remained still and silent. With no choice, I returned to the cabin for one last night. Everything I'd locked or barricaded before was now open. The windows were pushed up. The back door was swinging wide. Each piece of furniture seemed just a bit off center. Drawers were pulled open, boxes set on top of tables, as if someone or something was searching for something. I locked everything, built the biggest fire I could, and huddled, poker in hand, by the hearth. The old clock made its strange sound 3 times again. And this time, after the echo faded, I heard a scraping chorus of syllables from the loft, as if a dozen voices were trying to speak over each other in their sleep. Clutching the poker, I climbed the narrow ladder to the loft, the air turning cold around me. When my eyes adjusted, I saw the bed had been twisted. The comforter and sheets were pulled together to form the rough outline of a body, its head and arms folded across its chest. I did not touch it. I slowly backed down, never taking my eyes off the unmoving shape. Then, from the porch, there came a voice, not quite formed, ancient and breathless. My name it called, as if struggling to remember its own tongue. Come out. The voice was neither male nor female, but flat and broken, emotionless. I did not move, my whole body locked in place as I heard the sound of footsteps on the porch. After a long silence, 3 hard impacts, just like before, made the door tremble. I clamped my hands over my ears and whispered, "I'm not listening," over and over. The burning logs in the fireplace faded. Darkness collected, thick and oily, in the corners. I heard the dragging again, and then the whisper, right at the door. Come out now. By the time the sky began to shift from black to slate, I grabbed my bag and bolted. I did not look back as I sprinted through the gloom, pushing through brambles, dropping the poker somewhere among the roots. The sun had barely risen when I stumbled onto a side road where an old truck appeared, as if summoned from some half-remembered dream. The driver never asked why I was panting, wild-eyed, my arms cut and bleeding. He stared straight ahead, never speaking as he drove me to the nearest town. I slept for days. My grandfather still calls sometimes, telling me my things are still in the cabin. I let them stay there. Some places keep their stories alive not with words, but with silence. The woods around that cabin watch you, invite you deeper, whisper when you try to sleep. Whatever followed me that week has not found me since. But sometimes late at night, I hear a faint humming from the corner of my room. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see figures, barefoot and silent, pacing slow, deliberate circles in the frost. And I know the thing, or whatever haunted that place, is still waiting for me to listen. Never go alone where the mountains hum at midnight. And if you hear your name spoken by a voice you do not recognize, do not answer, no matter how many times it comes to your door. I never expected to inherit anything more than a few old photographs and maybe a piece of my grandmother's jewelry. But when the call came from a lawyer's office in a small town in eastern Kentucky, my life took a sharp turn into the unknown. My great-aunt, a woman my family rarely spoke of, had passed away, leaving behind an old hunting cabin tucked high up in the Appalachian foothills. It had been abandoned for decades, a wooden structure perched above a twisting dirt road that climbed through ridges and hollers. She had lived her final years as a recluse, rumor said, so woven into the mountain that local kids told stories about her while sitting around campfires. "Take a weekend," my father said on the phone, his voice distant. "Clear it out, see what's worth keeping, and get the keys back to the lawyer." With a traveler's curiosity and a young artist's appetite for strange landscapes, I bought a bus ticket and headed east. The drive from the courthouse wound through small towns and past farmhouses with sagging porches and peeling paint. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to a narrow dirt track that twisted through hollows carpeted with moss, rhododendron, and creeping fog. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was low, casting the mountain in gold and shadow. The cabin sat like it had grown from the earth itself. Its weathered wood was gray and cracked, the chimney stones mottled with moss, the roof sagging as if burdened by decades of snow and wind. The air smelled of pine, wet earth, and smoke from fires long gone. Inside, the single room was smaller than I imagined. A rough-hewn table, a battered cot, and a stone fireplace filled the space. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars of dried herbs, rusty tools, and layers of dust thick enough to write a name in. In one corner, an old tacked-up family tree had faded into pale yellow, a map of people long gone. There was no power, no running water, only the whisper of wind through the cracks. I set a lantern on the table, shook out a blanket, and began exploring. Beneath the cot, I found a small stack of hand-stitched journals, each one thick with yellowed pages. My great-aunt's initials were on the covers, but the entries spanned decades, some from before I was born. Most were mundane recipes for preserves, notes on herbs, the occasional sketch, but some spoke of voices in the holler at night, strange shapes glimpsed through the fog, and names whispered that were not her own. That night, the cabin felt alive. Fog rolled down the holler, curling around the trees and ridges like living fingers. I tried to sleep, but the air seemed charged with a presence, subtle yet insistent. Then came a series of soft, measured knocks on the door, deliberate and impossible to dismiss as wind. I froze. Nothing moved outside, yet the sound of breathing, faint and deliberate, brushed along the walls. And then came the whisper carried on the mountain wind, "Clara, come out." I pressed my back against the wall, remembering my great-aunt's old warning. Never answer the holler at night. Never follow voices you do not know. I tried to convince myself it was a neighbor, a lost hiker perhaps, but the road was hours away from the nearest house. Morning brought little relief. On the porch, a small bundle of twigs had been arranged in a pattern I could not decipher. The fog clung to the holler like a living thing, curling through every ridge and hollow. There were no footprints in the dirt road, no broken brush, only the twisting mist that made the forest seem older and more watchful than before. Over the next 2 days, the disturbances increased. Furniture shifted slightly while I slept. Doors left closed were found open, and the journals seemed to vibrate with an energy I could not name. When I went outside to check the perimeter, the forest seemed to stretch, ridges bending in ways that made the road seem longer and more convoluted than memory dictated. I realized the mountains themselves were alive in some strange, deliberate way, guiding me or perhaps testing me. By the third night, I dared not sleep. I built the largest fire I could in the stone fireplace, huddled beside it with a poker clutched in my hands. The wind outside carried voices, pleading and coaxing. They promised to show me the secrets of the holler, of old families, of the long-forgotten dead. Each syllable brushed my mind with names, faces, and memories I had never spoken aloud. At one point, I thought I saw the shadows of figures pacing slowly along the ridges, their feet bare, moving in deliberate circles, whispering my name and calling out in rhythms I could not follow. Dawn finally came, pale and cold. I bolted from the cabin, leaving the journals behind, the door wide open. The dirt road twisted endlessly, each turn feeling like the cabin itself was keeping me in place, folding the landscape over me like a trap. Eventually, I stumbled onto a side road where a pickup appeared, driven by a man who said nothing and stared straight ahead. He delivered me to the nearest town without a word. I have never returned to that cabin. My family sold the land years later. Yet sometimes, when the fog rolls through the ridges and hollers, I hear the faintest whisper of my name carried on the wind. The mountains remember. They remember all who enter and all who try to leave. Never go alone where the holler hums at night. Never answer a voice you do not recognize, for the mountains always keep their own. When I look back, I realize there were so many moments when we could have turned around. When that little voice in the back of my mind, the one that knows when the world is about to shift, told me to stop, to find an excuse to go home. But at 14, in the sticky anticipation of a long overdue adventure, you barely register fear until it is already a part of you. That autumn, my cousin offered her old family homestead for a weekend of freedom. It had become a tradition in our extended family, One night each year, when the adults gave the next generation the keys, a cooler of sodas, and a single warning: stay together, lock the doors. Maybe it was an act of trust or a test of our growing up. Maybe, looking back, it was something else. There were 8 of us: me, my best friend Jess, and our friends Megan, Cara, Emily, Bella, Chris, and Zach. Our caravan of parents dropped us off in the gray shimmer of a fading evening, their instructions still echoing in our ears. The hunger for independence overrode any worry. We were flushed with jokes about local legends, daring each other to spend the night awake. The homestead was modest. 2 small cabins tucked behind a creaky main house, with faded wallpaper, mismatched furniture, and that scent you only find in old buildings: dust, wood smoke, and something faintly herbal. I remember thinking how the place felt vulnerable even then. The nearest neighbor was more than 2 miles away, and the woods pressed close on all sides, bristling with secrets. We spent the first hours exploring, dumping our bags in glorified piles, laying claim to couches and floor space. Someone connected a speaker to their phone, and the place filled with music and laughter, making the dull day seem vibrant. Outside, a small trail curled up toward a ridge, and a stream made its way through thick undergrowth behind the property. By sunset, we were all high on fresh air and possibility. Night fell so fast it was as if a hand had thrown a blanket over the mountains. One moment, the sky was streaked with the last lines of sun. The next, it was pure darkness. Out of nowhere, the power went out. It was not a flicker or a sudden failure, simply warmth and light one moment, then black silence the next. Someone made a soft sound of surprise, followed by tentative, nervous giggles. "Old wiring," Jess said, her voice a little too steady. "No big deal." We scavenged for batteries, turned on 2 lanterns, and embraced the disruption as if we had planned a camping trip. Someone suggested going out to the old covered bridge by the stream to take pictures, feeling reckless and free from the rules that governed us back home. We bundled into jackets, snatching the one strong lantern and Jess's speaker, and filed down the faint trail toward the creek. The darkness pressed close, clawing and intimate. The trees on either side seemed to huddle closer, pulling us off center. Every sound, a twig breaking underfoot, the movement of water, a far-off bird, seemed too loud, too certain. The bridge itself, a sagging wooden structure with only one intact rail, spanned a lazy trickle of water, black and moving in the lantern light. We gathered in a clump, the music a soft, staticky background, and for a few precious minutes, everything felt possible. Then Chris stopped laughing. He was staring at the edge of the woods, frozen like a deer. "Do you see them?" he asked quietly. I turned, expecting to catch a firefly or a deer. What I saw made my legs go cold. At the margin, where the trees and darkness met the path, were shapes, 6 or 7 of them, standing utterly still, watching us from beneath the low boughs. They were too tall for children, too awkward in their stillness for adults. wore what looked like burlap sacks over their heads, tied with dark cord, with eye holes crudely torn out, blank and bottomless. Some of them held long, dark tools, bent iron shining dully, the edges glinting and smooth. "No way," Bella whispered. "That can't be real." The figures stood as though waiting for a cue. As the seconds stretched thin with terror, one began to walk forward. No hesitation, not hurried, not slow, but inevitable. The others followed in a block, moving with the unbroken rhythm of practiced purpose. No words, no shouts. Someone dropped the speaker. The music cut off with a sudden, sharp sound, plunging us into full silence, save for the intake of breath and the rushing of the creek. Panic fractured the group instantly. Kara bolted first, then Megan, then Bella and Emily in a flash. No one screamed. We just ran. Jess and I hesitated, frozen to the spot. The figures came faster. The lantern's light bounced across the ragged eye holes, catching nothing but darkness inside. The nearest figure's hand held something that glinted. A meat hook or an old hatchet. Jess grabbed my arm and pulled me away just as I felt the grass shift beneath my feet. We barreled into the trees, scrambling for purchase, our heartbeats loud in my ears. Branches clawed at our faces. Mud sucked at our boots. Behind us, the heavy sound of boots followed. Unlike us, not stumbling, not chaotic, just relentless. Between flashes of panic, I kept thinking, they're not supposed to be here. They can't be real. The lantern fell, vanishing between the roots. Darkness swarmed in. We ran for what felt like forever, stumbling, sometimes hearing the others yell, and sometimes not. Everything in the world narrowed to breathe and fear, and the sound of movement behind us, never quite catching up, but never falling behind. Just before the cabin, an old rail fence cut across our path, the only real barrier between the woods and home. Jess scrambled over and nearly twisted her ankle, landing with a heavy sound. I tried to leap and felt a hand brush the small of my back. Just a whisper of a touch, like someone trying to see what I felt like up close. Then I tumbled headlong into the dirt. I did not look back. I've never been able to decide if not looking was an act of bravery or terror. Eventually, we all found each other. We slammed the cabin door, locked it tight, and collapsed on the main room floor as if the thin lock meant the world. The others were all there, except Chris. His hand was slick with blood, a deep, raw cut across his palm. He said that as he jumped the fence, one of the figures grabbed him, and he barely got free, leaving a slash across his skin that throbbed and gleamed under the lantern's glow. We waited for noise, for fists on the door, or the sound of breaking glass, but there was nothing. We killed the lantern, huddling in absolute darkness, listening to the rhythm of our own hearts. No voices, no shouts, just the heavy press of the woods, and the memory of blank, inhuman masks. 2 hours later, the sheriff arrived. The frantic call made from the cranky old landline in the kitchen had finally made it through. The officers swept the path, the bridge, and the woods for footprints, signs, evidence of an attack. They found nothing. The mud was smooth and undisturbed, save for our own. And the only things left at the bridge were our jackets and the dropped speaker, untouched. It was a prank, the deputy said, his eyes darting to the scar on Chris's hand. Town kids, costume troublemakers. But in my head, I replayed the silent advance, the way the sacks shifted and caught the light, those long, slow-bladed tools, the deliberate way they moved, the sense that this wasn't a prank at all, but a ritual so old that even its meaning had degraded with time. None of us slept. The sun rose eventually, pale and cold through the smudged windows. We did not wait for our parents to return. By the time they arrived, we were already packed and waiting at the edge of the porch, silent as mourning doves. My cousin sold the homestead before winter crept in. She never said why, but the day she handed over the keys, she hugged each of us long and hard. Years have gone, yet Chris's scar has never quite faded. Sometimes at odd moments, when the world is shadowed and the trees are bare, I'll smell old coffee and dust and remember the sackheads by the old bridge. I still wonder what they would have done if one of us had not made it over the fence, if our shouts had not carried to the distant cabin, if their patience, so much like the waiting of trees and rocks, had been rewarded. I know only that some places keep their secrets well, and that in the shadowed woods of the mountains, the oldest dangers have often forgotten why they began, but will never forget what it means to finish what they started. When people ask why I do not go to the homestead anymore, I tell them the truth. Sometimes the things you meet in the woods wear masks. Sometimes masks are not for pretending. They are for remembering. And for those of us who survive, the memory is enough. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, lovely souls. I hope this story brought you a moment of calm and curiosity. I'd love to know what part of the story stayed with you the most. Drop a comment and share your thoughts. I always love hearing from you. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue exploring these quiet moments together. Now, take one last deep, gentle breath. Get cozy and let the calm of the night carry you softly until we meet again.